Okay, this says I'm live. Not sure why that message is. Okay. But I don't know if I'm live. Anybody there? Oh my goodness. This says I'm live, and I don't see anything. I hear Jeff talking, but I don't hear Jeff. Why is it saying my connection is weak?
Hey there.
Yeah, I'm here. My internet dropped off on this crappy laptop again. I don't know what's going on. Okay, are you back? All right.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, so it says I'm back up. Well, thank goodness we went. We did a preview. Do you all see me there?
Well, let me see if I can get
I don't
back.
see
Okay,
Jeremy
I got
there.
you. Well, I don't know what just happened here. Hold a second.
All right. Well, it dropped off. The whole thing.
Oh, there we go.
The internet.
For some reason, whenever I'm okay, there we go.
Okay.
I'm not getting any audio.
You're not getting audio.
Oh, now I am. Okay.
Okay.
But it's it's interesting. On your screen, I'm getting like all of these other YouTube.
Yeah, it's because it restarted. That's the problem. You have to go with the most current with the top one there. It's. Oh,
Okay,
gosh.
gotcha. Oh, wait.
It should have a little live red thing.
No,
next to
hold a
it.
second. Hold a second. I just screwed up. Give me a second.
But it looks like that's a problem everybody's having because I'm not getting people now. So I've got to
Okay.
go back.
Okay. I think we're back.
Okay, so this is really super annoying. I don't know why this.
It's System stream ended 2 minutes ago. Let me.
Okay, so I've got it now. So the only one showing on my page is the one that I'm currently on, and it just says I have
Okay,
one
hold a
viewer.
second. Let me.
Two viewers are on there. So somebody's watching the two right now, according to that. So anyway, yeah.
Let me.
I'm going to drop that because it's streaming the video. That might free up some. I shouldn't have a bandwidth problem, but I get two people on there now. So it's 9:59.
Okay.
If anybody's on there and can hear us, please drop us a thing in chat so we can see that you're there. Oh, Octavia. Hi, guys. Sound
Octavia.
okay, Octavia says he's got us. Okay, excellent. All right, we're about ready to start then. Let's hope and pray.
Well, hold a second. Because I'm having difficulties here trying to find you.
Okay. All right, it's 10 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and start this music.
Okay.
Well, welcome, folks, to our broadcast, our live stream today on Security Sector Forum for National Defense in Liberia, 2007-2008, Rebuilding the Armed Forces of Liberia. Hey, Paulie, good to see you there. I see you're up. We've had some technical difficulties, hence Jeff Rodriguez and I did a pre-broadcast, and of course the internet went out on this side. I feel like I'm home back in Africa with my electricity having gone out for 4 hours yesterday and now my internet dropping off. I guess the Wuhan coronavirus, or COVID-19 by its scientific name, is overtaking the world. So, folks, thanks for tuning in. As we go along, if you've got questions, hey, Roland, good to see you there. Then we'll take your questions to go along. But let me just introduce what's going on here, and then I'm going to show a short video. Occasionally, I'm going to check to make sure I still have Jeff Rodriguez, because we've also been having trouble with Skype. So, Jeff, are you still there?
I'm here.
All right, excellent. So let me just frame this very quickly. I'm retired Colonel Chris Wyatt. I just retired from active duty from the U.S. Army on October 1st of 2019, so just 6 months ago. And just this week, I packed up all my uniforms and put them in the basement because it looks like I'm not being called back. So that's gone now. But I was the chief of the Office of Defense Cooperation, later named the Office of Security Cooperation at the American Embassy in Monrovia from 2007 until 2008. during which time I was responsible as the Government Technical Monitor, or GTM, for the Department of State to oversee the Security Sector Reform Program for national defense in Liberia. It was, without a doubt, one of the most rewarding and challenging periods and experiences of my life. And today, joining me on the stream will be Mr. Jeff Rodriguez, who worked for DynCorp at the time, one of the contractors in Liberia. He was the program manager, and I'll have him introduce himself here shortly. But before we get started, let me just see if I can get this video to work. I've got a plan here, and hopefully it will work out. So I want to show you a quick video of something that we recorded when I was in Liberia. So let's see if I can get it to work here. It's not coming up, okay? All right, so that doesn't work. I'll get back to it later. I'll show you that video a little bit later. Anyway, so today we're taking your questions. If you have any questions about the process, we'll be happy to share or answer your questions as best we can. So once again, as I said, I'm retired Colonel Chris Wyatt, and I was responsible for the program while I was there. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the experiences, what happened, and let me just bring up, before we get Jeff in here to introduce himself, I'll put something on the back of the screen here. I want to talk about what the mission was for the American Embassy. So there you go. Bring that up there. Everybody should be able to see that here in just a second. There's a slight delay for things coming up on the screen. All right, so Jeff, if you could introduce yourself very quickly, appreciate it.
Sure. As Chris said, I'm Jeff Rodriguez. I was really lucky and proud to be the program manager for the DynCorp Security Sector Reform Program in Monrovia. Prior to that, I was a Army officer, 20 years active duty experience. Primarily started out in the Signal Corps, then transferred over to Special Operations with my background in civil affairs and psychological operations. And right now, I'm a president of a defense contracting company in Oklahoma, and proud of, and happy to be here, be a part of this.
So, Jeff, when did you first get to Liberia to work security sector reform, and when did you depart?
I arrived in Liberia, I believe it was July of 2006, and I stayed through August of 2009. It was supposed to be a 6-month tour, by the way.
Yeah, I've had a few of those myself in my experience on active duty. Bosnia being one of them. That was a 3-month tour that became an 8-month tour, so not quite as lengthy as your experience in Liberia. But you were there for a big part of it. We're going to focus today on when I was there, not because of me, but because that's what I'm going to relate. And you were there throughout that time period working with us. So this should be interesting. I think I've got the video now. Let me go ahead and pull it up, okay, and see if it works. If when it comes on the screen you cannot hear it, then I'll need people to let me know. But you should be able to see this on the screen. Okay, where's it at? There it is.
These soldiers are part of Liberia's new army, which numbers only a couple of thousand. After the war, which ended in 2003, the UN helped demobilize former fighters while the new government, with United States help, began recruiting. New trainees must meet much higher eligibility requirements.
In the military, the boss is the battlefield operating system.
Private American companies are training the Liberian soldiers. The military contractors were hired and paid for by the U.S. government. These soldiers are being drilled on battlefield tactics.
Representing all 15 of Liberia's counties.
Lieutenant Colonel Chris Wyatt of the U.S. Army is in charge of the training. He says there have been concerns about the use of private contractors.
The question isn't whether they're private or public. The question is whether they're competent in doing the proper job. This is not the government's army. It's not the American army. It is the people of Liberia's army.
The UN mission also established training for the National Police Force, which is expected to take on many of the peacekeepers' roles. Unlike UN troops, police are not allowed to carry guns. Skirmishes and crime are frequent in Liberia, and it has been difficult for the police to gain respect.
Well, those should be some very reminiscent scenes for those of us who were in Monrovia at that time and those still in Monrovia. Hopefully you're not seeing those scenes where the police are not being respected. But can you folks still hear me out there? Give me a little chat response there. Jeff, am I still got you there? Jeff? I take it, okay, so, okay, you got me, you're chatting, okay. Well, so there you have it, folks. That's a little video from the Voice of America they recorded during our time in Liberia talking about it. Now, for those, if you heard the comments, I intentionally made that comment about this is not America's army, it's not the government of Liberia's army, the army belongs to the people of Liberia. That was very much intentional. A big part of the focus for what we were trying to accomplish there was that we wanted folks to understand that the role of the military is to protect people, property, and their liberties, and defend the country from foreign invaders, protect the national sovereignty of the country. So that was a very important message we wanted to get across during security sector reform, and hopefully we accomplished that. That's what we were trying to accomplish, and that was the focus throughout. My predecessor, I think, did a bang-up job before my arrival at the embassy, Navy officer, Commander Dan Honkin at the time, and I think he did a pretty good job, but he had a lot of constraints. We all did, but one of the constraints was there simply wasn't any money for long stretches of time. And when I arrived, through the efforts of Ambassador Don Booth and Congress and Liberian Americans in the U.S., we were able to get some additional funding. The State Department was able to move some funding around, and unfortunately, we were able to pick up the program full steam. So shortly after I arrived, I sat down with the program managers. At the time, it was Glenn Yacovetta for PAE, and it was Jeff for DynCorp, and we started having a weekly meeting in which we ironed out the concerns and the issues. And money was always a big issue here. And so both companies really had to focus on trying to get the mission done when there often wasn't money on hand. So that was a real challenge. So if you look at the slide there, I just want to put that up. That's from actual command briefing that I put together while I was in Liberia. The intent of this was to let people know what we were doing. For those not aware of it, and for the Liberians who are listening today or who are in the AFL, the Armed Forces of Liberia, you remember quite well that there was a lot of supposition, a lot of conspiracy theory going on in this time frame about why the Americans were training the armed forces of Liberia, that they were building a super army that was going to be a threat to its neighbors. Now you have to remember the context. This was shortly after Liberia's 13-year civil war, or as most Liberians in Monrovia always told me, Liberia's World War. So it was shortly after that, and what happened is that a lot of the neighbors, for instance Sierra Leone and Guinea, were concerned, as was Ivory Coast, that Liberia would be used once again as a base to undermine their governance and their politicians, as had been done under Charles Taylor. So one of the big things we were trying to do was confidence building, to let people know that this was a force for good, and that the role of a professional military was to protect people and property, not to prey on them, not to take advantage of them. So this is what we were trying to accomplish, hence the mission statement here, which we clearly wanted to make available to people. So none of this is classified information. So unlike, Snowden or these other folks, I'm not disclosing any state secrets here, folks. But these are things that most people aren't fully aware of because they were internal to the program or within the U.S. government, or just not something that you generally share in the public. Not because they were sensitive, but just because not everybody attended those meetings. So here you go. The Office of Security Cooperation. This is a later slide. I would adjust this mission as we went along. This was our mission. So our job was there to provide security assistance and security cooperation to Liberia for the Department of Defense, Defense Security Cooperation Agency, U.S. Africa Command. And prior to that, when I first arrived, it was U.S. European Command. But we transitioned on the 1st of May 2008 from European Command to Africa Command Control. And so this was after that. And then I specifically spelled out what the purpose of our security sector reform mission was, because it's funny, when I first got to Liberia, I was known as the security sector reform guy, the SSR guy. So people all over the country would hunt me down. I was a major when I first arrived, and shortly afterwards was promoted to lieutenant colonel at the embassy. Nothing to do with my Liberia tour, but it was a pleasure being promoted there. But people would hunt me down. It's the SSR guy. And people would ask me questions about prisons, the correction officers, the borders, the customs, immigration, the LMP, the Liberian National Police. I'm like, guys. I am just here for security sector reform for national defense. And I had never heard it termed that way before, either in doctrine or in Liberia itself. I started calling it that. I found out later that actually was a legitimate term. I just hadn't heard it. And so for those who don't know, security sector reform as a doctrine is a relatively recent development, although countries have been doing it for centuries. It just appeared on the scene academically about just a little over 20 years ago. And so this was early days of it, when we were doing in Liberia. So specifically, we wanted a message that said this is the mission for security sector reform. So there you go. Build, equip, and train a professional apolitical force of 2,000 soldiers for the Armed Forces Liberia under the Security Sector Reform for National Defense Program. And that's what we were trying to do. So Jeff, let me get you in here. I've talked for a couple minutes. Make sure we keep our audience. I don't want to bore them. So when you got there, what was DynCorp up to? Because your mission changed over time. You guys were working for demobilization and other things. So tell us a little bit about your mission when you got there.
Right. So to highlight what Chris was saying, when I got there, both contractors actually, we were still in the crawl phase of our contracts. We had a 5-year contract to not only demobilize the existing AFL when we first got there, but then to recruit, vet, and train for a 2,000 man force, almost a brigade-sized level of soldiers. On top of that, we also had to recruit and train a military band. We had to build and refurbish two training bases, train and vet a military defense staff, and the biggest chunk of it was really the recruiting and vetting piece, where we had to recruit and vet over 14,000 Liberians that wanted to join the AFL, and then take the best of that bunch and train them to be a 2,000 man force. And as Chris was saying, that mission evolved a little bit because we also, towards the end of the contract, selected out of that 2,100 man pool a portion to be part of the Liberian Coast Guard and the Armed Forces Training Command, which is like their, for a U.S. comparison, almost like their training and doctrine command. So there were a lot of ebbs and flows during that time. We had a lot of unique challenges, like Chris mentioned, most of which was funding. And to the eyes of the Liberian people, because they didn't realize it was a funding issue, so they would see us contractors there literally stopping in place, not being able to do anything. Meanwhile, people were getting apprehensive that we were not going to be able to meet our contract objectives.
Well, let me frame this for you, Jeff. Tell me if you think this is a fair statement. So when I arrived there in May of 2007 and really took over the first week of June 2007, this is my recollection. We had 102 soldiers, which came from the initial course, which was conducted at the Barclay Training Center. That was out of a cohort of 105. 3 didn't make it, but 102 made it. From the 102, we had 34 NCOs and 9 second lieutenants, one of which is now the Minister of Defense, Daniel Ziakon. Another is the Chief of Staff for the Armed Forces Liberia, Major General Prince Johnson. And the third one is Brigadier General Geraldine George. So I arrived, and at the time, not only did we not have money, but the program was kind of stopped. Both contractors were working at risk, and it was 2.5 years old, the program at that point. And before I arrived and I accepted the job in Liberia, I actually did get to say no, although I seriously doubt they would have not let me go. But I took it on with enthusiasm. But before I went, I understood that the program would be complete on my arrival. 2,000 soldiers, and light infantry brigade, the training completed, and I would just have a standard security sector, or not security sector, but security assistance job in which I would prepare Liberians to go to American schools, coordinate exercises, and attend ceremonies and things like that. But in fact, I arrived with a force of 102 soldiers and no money, and we were kind of stuck. Is that a fair recollection?
Yes, that is.
Well, it's interesting, and I quickly discovered things that I had no idea about. For instance, I discovered that the band wasn't even part of your contract, that someone in the Liberian government said, hey, where's the band at? And no one had really prepared to do a band, so DynCorp had to jump through hoops to come up with a program to do this. And as far as I know, it was one of the first times, if not the first time ever, that we had relied on a contractor to build a band for a military. What about that?
That is correct, and let me tell you, trying to find someone with that type of experience that was willing actually to go to Liberia was a daunting task in itself. But we were able to find the right guy for it, and it became a really prominent feature of the AFL was the band.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I would have to say a couple of things about the band. One, it was difficult because we were constrained about what support we could provide for them because it was not part of the original contract. So once you guys trained them and turned them over to responsibility from the Ministry of Defense, they were no longer technically part of our program. And that created all sorts of problems because the Ministry of Defense, bless their hearts at that time, wasn't resourced for a band, either to provide transportation or meals or new equipment, things like that. So
they didn't have, if I remember, and you probably remember better than I do, I don't think they had any housing set aside for them because, like you were mentioning, they were not part of the quote unquote, the AFL structure where, once we would house them, train them, then we would turn them over to PAE where they would be, go on for follow-on training and housed over at EBK Barracks or Shefflin Barracks at the time. But there was no housing set aside for the band.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole thing was a surprise to me. I will say this, though. The first time I saw the band rehearsing, I was impressed. But the first ceremony I ever did, and folks who don't know, we did a lot of ceremonies, a lot of unit activations, a lot of graduations for one course after another. Jeff knows this full well. We spent a lot of time on graduations for courses. But one thing that definitely stood out for me is that whenever the band would perform, eyes would well up, tears would form in the eyes of most Liberians who took great pride in seeing that band dressed so well, playing so well, and representing the AFL and Liberia. What do you think, Jeff?
Oh, that is absolutely spot on. Especially playing military marches. That's pretty generic. Any organized military that has a band has their own. They play the standard marching songs, but whenever they would play the Liberian national anthem, even though I'm not Liberian, it actually got me emotional because you could just sense the pride, not only in the people that were in the stands, but of the soldiers who were training. Because again, these are, the band is part of the AFL, and they are, honoring their nation and honoring those soldiers that just completed the training. So yeah, it was very emotional to see him play.
Well, I mentioned graduation, so I was interviewed by Star Radio, a local station there in Monrovia, and here's a short clip of a interview, one of my first interviews after we did the first military police graduation. So let me see if I can get that up and running, and if you guys can hear it.
Oh, indeed, they're up to the task. And intelligence, excellent scores. The average for the class was 94% on 100. The undergraduate, a private, had 97.7. Very sharp, very dedicated professional soldiers.
What was the duration of the training?
10 weeks.
You think in 10 weeks, can they do better? Can they actually perform in 10 weeks?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That is the right length for the course. If you look at the topics they've been trained in law enforcement, in garrison, also in operations in combat, and so now they're prepared to do the things that military police around the world do in units.
How was the selection done?
Well, the selection goes back to when they first became soldiers in the AFL. When they went to their initial entry training, prior to that, every applicant to the AFL takes an examination. And based on their performance in the examination, their score, it determines which career fields they'll be able to serve in. And you have to receive a higher score to become a military policeman. And so they were selected based on that. And also on their performance in the initial training. At the time was at the Barclay Training Center. Now that same training is conducted out at Camp Ware in Carysburg.
Do they have the height for MP?
The height, they're fine. That's not a problem. You don't have to be 7 feet tall. That's just for basketball, not to be an MP. The next military police course, we may do it as soon as January or February because we need to train a number of additional military policemen in order to meet the number necessary for the 2,000. The number necessary right now is 105.
I got
What basically will be their functions?
All right, so I'm guessing
In peacetime, they have responsibility for helping commanders maintain discipline, conducting law enforcement on military installations, coordinate with the National Police, but they won't conduct any law enforcement operations outside of military military
now.
installations.
Okay, excellent.
Their
All right, so,
responsibility, their
yeah, so
charge
that's the FP
is to
graduation.
work inside military installations such as the Barclay Training
journalist asked me
Center,
a question about
Camp
do they have the
Ware,
height?
or EBK right here at
What, you
Edward
mean for the
Binyat
MPA?
Kesley Military Barracks.
No, that's not a
When you spoke
requirement.
earlier, you
in
said
military
military
courses. Just a
personnel
good,
should not pose
aptitude
threats.
score, which matters.
What would you
So
say?
that's a little
My
about
point
that.
is that there is a perception in Liberia that the military is something to be afraid of or be concerned about. And that's certainly understandable from Liberia's recent past. Nearly 2 decades of civil conflict is a terrible thing. But a military's purpose is not to terrorize or to frighten its citizens. Its job is to protect its citizens from external threats, and that's what an army does. And military policemen play an important role in that, helping commanders keep soldiers
they are definitely,
and also performing many specific functions on the battlefield.
We did get requests from other international organizations to find out what was our secret sauce in the recruiting and vetting side, and I think a lot of it had to do with the original planners that came up with the overall R&V plan. You know, guys like Paul Meadows, Joseph Assange, Christian Bach. There were a lot of these guys that got together with a lot of smart people and developed our R&V plan. And the big thing about it was we purposely try to make it as transparent as possible, so everyone knew what exactly the qualifications were for. Anyone that was interested in applying to be a member of the AFL was eligible to apply, but that didn't always translate to them being accepted. You know, at the end, they had to pass several gates, so to speak, to get in. You know, first of all, they had to prove that they could read and write. They had to pass a Army physical fitness test. They had to pass the West African Educational Standard Test, so we could gauge what their educational level was. And then that's just to be selected in the pool. And then after that, our background investigators would go out there and do an extensive vetting of those candidates, which, they would keep investigating them until they could not investigate it any further. And if they were selected, with the help of the UNMIL folks, if they were selected to be a member of one of the classes, we would print out their photos. And there was a hotline where if anybody recognized any of the people that were selected to join the AFL, they could call in even up to a year after their selection if there was any derogatory information that was not found out during the vetting process, and we would then reinvestigate them. And if those allegations proved to be true, we would kick them out of the military.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting time for him. Hey, Jeremy, thanks. Jeremy keeps me up to date here with the chat, so I can see that that video clip is off. I guess it was running in the background. So thanks for that. So yeah, that was one thing we should talk about here is that what gets lost in this is oftentimes a lot of people assume inside the U.S. government in West Africa, in ECOWAS, and Liberians in particular, that the U.S. government ran the show here. Let me be clear about something. The U.S. government funded this. The U.S. government ran the actual execution of the program, and we designed the program, but we did so based on Liberian objectives and goals. Initially, those objectives and goals were set by the transitional government under Judy Bryant, but then when President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came in, she and her government and Minister Samakai are the ones that set the goals. But the challenge, and I know that Minister Samakai found himself frustrated oftentimes with the program, is that much of what was already in motion could not simply be changed. It was, for instance, construction schedules for refurbishing facilities, the recruiting vetting process. You can't change things midstream and have different standards. But I will say the following, and Jeff, you can confirm this, but hopefully you'll confirm it. I'm sure you will. But one of the things about it is that, so for instance, the government of Liberia told us that they wanted high school graduates. That wasn't a standard that the Americans set. Now that happens to be a standard for the U.S. military. We make exceptions for some people who don't have high school diplomas, but by and large, everyone who enters the U.S. military is normally a high school graduate, with very few exceptions. The Liberians demanded that that be the case. So an accommodation was made for that, as Jeff alluded to, as West African Education Council examination, something like that. This examination tests literacy and skills for people. And so what happened was that the test would be administered, and it would determine what level someone was at. So it would let you know if that person was not literate, and say at a 7th or 8th grade level, or if they're at a level high enough to be a high school graduate. So based on that, we could determine, and this was especially important. It's especially important when it came to women. A fair number of the women who joined the AFL did not have the opportunity to attend formal schooling of any sort. Oftentimes, they became literate because grandma was teaching them under a tree in the midst of a conflict or something. I'm embellishing slightly, but you get my point. They were denied an opportunity. So what happened is that this test said, okay, you're the equivalent of high school graduate. So if you didn't have a diploma, it was okay. You could have this score. And that was a key factor in getting people into the AFL. Is that accurate, Jeff?
Yes, extremely so.
Yeah, so this was an important consideration. We weren't setting the standards. Now, the other standard here that a lot of people assume is that the Americans just want to make a little American army. No. The United States and Liberia have a long history, for good or bad. We have a long history, and it is something that the Liberians asked for. The Liberian government wanted a professional military on the order of the United States Army, and so they wanted U.S. Army standards. So we applied U.S. Army standards, and those are the things that the AFL has taken as their own and have adapted as they've gone forward since we ended the security sector reform program. So I just want to make sure that people knew that, because oftentimes people come to me and talk about, you're just building an American army, they're just going to harass their neighbors. In fact, that's not what the AFL has done. It has gone by U.S. Army standards and adapted them for the Liberian context. But since its creation, the new AFL has been a force for good. We're going to talk about that before we get to the end of this. But I just want to talk a little bit about the recruiting and vetting there, because I really think it's a gold standard, and I think it's something that people should be impressed with. I'm sure you'll agree with that, Jeff.
Oh, absolutely. Again, I do remember being contacted by the UN because they wanted to do something very similar in one of their missions in another African country. And Ambassador Booth at the time spoke very highly of it. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who came after Ambassador Booth, also was very proud of that program. And honestly, even Minister Samakai, even though we may have had slight disagreements on the training portion and the way we treated, the officers versus the enlisted, he had no negative comments at all about recruiting and vetting. So when you have, the chief of the military in Liberia, confirming that the R&V process was great and transparent, and he was also a key advocate of it. I think it just goes back to what you were mentioning, Chris, that it was a gold standard out there. I think on your slide here it says that we recruited and vetted over 14,000 applicants, but one key statistic that you're not mentioning here is that out of that 14,000, only 18% of that figure actually made it all the way through the process. And, so I think it came up with roughly a pool of about 4,000 or something, of which we selected the 2,100 soldiers that actually became members of the AFL.
Yeah, no, the slide here, Jeff, and I was about to go to that because it's been up for a while, but this is just a snapshot in time, and I'll update it with some of the figures as go along. But that was a statistic that it depended on the audience who you told that, because if you tell people only 18% qualified, then, whoa, why are you excluding people? I'm sorry, but a person missing a leg can't serve on active duty in the Army. So they can apply, but they can't serve. A person who's not literate cannot serve as per the Liberian government's request that their soldiers be literate, and so forth. The person with HIV at the time could not enlist. Once you got HIV, we had to work that policy out later on. You were allowed to stay, but you could not come in with HIV or active TB. So people, and this is no different than it is for American military. Only about 20% or so of American youth of age for military service are actually fit and qualify for military service. So it's a similar sort of situation. But yeah, it's a good point. Well, let me run through this slide here very quickly and then talk about that. So among the things that happened, it wasn't simply rebuilding the Armed Forces of Liberia. There was much more to this for national defense. So, for instance, one of the things in which DynCorp was heavily involved was the demobilization of the Armed Forces of Liberia, the original AFL. And that AFL had about 14,000 members, most of whom had been in uniform for 20 years or longer, so they were quite long in the tooth, many of them. That was a very difficult process, and then there was a question of what about separation pay for these people? Where's that going to come from? And I don't know the full history of that. I do know it second and third hand and from other sources, but I understand that it wasn't really something thought about up front well enough, and so they had to go out and get donors. And the donors include the United States, China, South Africa, and others who contributed money which could be used for severance pay to dismiss the original members. Now, one thing you should know is that if a person had served in the old AFL or in LERD or any of the other groups, any of the rebel groups and involved in the conflict, that did not preclude them from joining the new AFL, provided the background check and the vetting did not find any information that they had committed crimes, either war crimes or criminal activity, or been involved in any untoward activity. So we had a number of folks who served in the old AFL or the rebel forces who joined the new AFL because they had clean backgrounds and they met the standard. The other thing you should know is that if you were in the old AFL and you were a staff sergeant or a captain, you entered the new AFL as a private. Everyone went through the same process. Now, this created its own challenges. In Sierra Leone, next door, where the British ran the program for security sector reform, they simply took the existing RSLAF, the Royal Sierra Leonean Armed Forces, the RSLAF, and kept the force and reformed it from what existed. In Liberia, the decision was taken by the Liberian government, the United States, and I believe the UN had a voice in this too, but I can't say for certain. But the decision was taken that, nope, we got to start from a clean slate. This has got to start all over again. And so that created some challenges, not the least of which is what happens once you have hundreds of privates. Who are the leaders, especially new people who've never served in uniform? What experience do they have? And at some point, this created a problem for us. This is a problem I recognized the moment I arrived and tried to address, but didn't have success initially. But by working with a person known as the command officer in charge, that was a Nigerian 2-star at the Ministry of Defense, and with the minister, and for my time it was Major General Abdul Rahman, who unfortunately has passed away a couple years ago while I was in New York. Quite a gentleman, quite a good human being. Did a bang-up job when he was there. But I should mention, before we go any further on the slide, though, because Jeff mentioned Minister Samakai, Jeff and Minister Samakai didn't always see eye to eye on things. Would that be fair to say, Jeff?
That would be putting it mildly, yes.
Yeah, that's so. As the guy in charge of overseeing the program and giving it direction, trying to make sure the contractors had the resources they needed, and also, to be fair, making sure they were doing the job they're supposed to be doing. One of my responsibilities is also to run interference and hopefully cut the tension between actors involved in the program. So yeah, Jeff and the minister didn't always see eye to eye, but I think they both respected each other, and we got a lot accomplished from that relationship.
No, that's true. I mean, and it was never personal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not. I don't think neither one of us hated each other. It's just that we had different. I had to follow the contract because the contract is my Bible, and the minister felt that as the end user, he should have a say in how that contract was administered, and that was really the conflict. And if I was in his shoes, I would probably feel the same way. But as Chris is mentioning, the thing is, I've got to follow. It's a State Department, it's a U.S. government funded contract, and I've got to follow it.
Well, that's absolutely the case, and I recognize that right away. Is that the ministry found itself in an awkward position. So the next thing on this list is that they demobilized the Ministry of Defense. Not just the Army, but the Ministry of Defense, and retrained 110 new candidates through a 16-week course, which DynCorp ran, and from that 110 who attended the course, 91 were hired back in the ministry. So the minister had a new ministry with employees who were trained in how to run defense and how to run large organizations and budgets and planning and all that. But he didn't have operational control of the Armed Forces Liberian, and for him, that was a very frustrating situation. I can understand that. So I empathized and got that from the outset. I'm not sure if my predecessor did or didn't empathize, but I empathized, which put me in an awkward position. But the bottom line is that eventually the Ministry of Defense would be the end user of the AFL or the owner of it, but they did not have operational control. That rested with the American Embassy at this stage and under me. So not to get a big head, but that was the reality. So I'm going to see a question from Paulie. I'll get to it in just a moment here. So the demobilization of the Ministry of Defense, the retraining of them, then the recruiting and vetting, as we talked about. This was in mid-2008, 14,000. I'm not sure what the final number was. I think you might have pushed over 15,000. But then also part of this was reconstructing the facilities necessary for the military to use, both housing, training facilities, bases with plumbing, facilities, abolition units, training areas, barracks, all of these things, obstacle courses, rifle ranges, all that had to be built. And so we had three main bases we were using: the Barclay Training Center, which is located in Monrovia, just down the hill from the embassy and just down the other hill from the Ministry of Defense at the time. It was known as the Voice of America site, which is an old retransmission Voice of America radio site that had been up since the Second World War, located out near Carysburg. So not far as the crow flies, but based on the roads at the time, take you a good hour or so to get out there just to get to the base. And that became the main training base after we got really into the program, after my arrival. And then EBK, Edward Binya Kesley Barracks, formerly known as Camp Schieffelin or Shefflin, and that was renamed EBK. So what we had is those bases. And then you see graduated 1,633 recruits, 4 advanced individual training courses, 4 basic non-commissioned officer courses, and officer candidate schools. Well, at the end of the day, when we finished all the training, the initial training, and my departure, we had trained 2,137 librarians who'd been recruited and vetted, brought into the force, trained them through basic training, advanced infantry training. Every soldier, male and female, got infantry training as a designation especially. And then select numbers, and it was a total, I think at that time, of 800 that we ran through the NCO course so they could be qualified to be non-commissioned officers. But the Ministry of Defense had to promote them, and there wasn't much money for that. So they were qualified, but many didn't get promoted. And then the Officer Candidate School for university graduates who ostensibly showed leadership skills. In the beginning, we had that. We had officer candidates who had university degrees and had leadership potential and the skills. But as we moved on, we moved in large measure to more just folks who had university degrees, and we had to be more flexible. So we were on the hook to provide 67 second lieutenants based on the force structure. When we finished the program, we had produced 127 second lieutenants for them. And then, of course, the band, which wasn't mentioned there. So, Jeff, if you want to add something to this, and I'm going to come back here and answer Paulie's question. So go ahead. Do you have anything to say about the stuff I just said there?
Well, yeah, and this kind of goes back to what you stated earlier in the broadcast here about some of the challenges we were facing. So the Voice of America site that was out in Carysburg, we had to delay any construction or rehabilitation of the existing structures there because there were two, I believe it was a Nigerian and a Ghanaian battalion that were using the structures that we were identified to rehabilitate. They were using it as housing for those two battalions that were located up there. So we had to wait until UNMEL was able to secure another site for these two units to move to, so we could go back in the back end and rehabilitate the barracks and the training areas that we had identified. And also, we had to build an entirely new structure that was not on the Voice America site to house our trainers, the dining facility, the gymnasium, the other training and admin building, the obstacle course, and the rifle range that was out there. So, yeah, that was a big challenge out there. But luckily, we had the right group of folks that came out there and was able to make all that happen once we got to go to do it.
Well, you had a fantastic dining facility out there at the VOA site. That was really wonderful. And one thing people should know is that people always make assumptions about things, and one of the assumptions that was made about the program is that again, we were training folks as Americans, expecting them to be Americans, and so a lot of people, when I would talk to them, like, well, you're just feeding them hamburgers and pizza. I'm like, no, we're not. DynCorp is contracted with a local vendor, someone who produces Liberian food, and the menu in the dining facility was the traditional Liberian food, was it not, Jeff?
Yes and no. So one of the things we learned, and actually it was really from the very first trade. you got to remember the first training class that we did run. We didn't have the facility up at Voice of America site or Camp Ware. We actually trained the first class at the Barclay Training Center. So everything was a condensed thing. And so we didn't have a DFAC or a dining facility set up for them. So we actually catered breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the trainees and for the instructor staff. Our initial menu, so to speak, was a westernized menu, which we found out was not probably the best way to feed the trainees. So based on that, we took our lessons learned, which is, again, a testament to my team up there, was that after every training event, after any major event, we would always do an after action review. And that was one of the things they brought up, that the trainees really wanted a more traditional Liberian menu for the trainees. So when we went over to Camp Ware, like you mentioned, Chris, we made sure that the local vendors out there, the local cooking staff, cooked a traditional Liberian menu for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And as Jeremy just mentioned up there, rice, fish, sauce, the traditional fufu, the traditional menus out there where our trainees, our instructor staff would get the traditional American meals. So, yes. So, yes and no to your question.
Well, again, I wasn't there for the initial cohort, the 102 that you trained at the Barclay Training Center, so I didn't see that. So I only saw when we moved out to Camp Ware or the Voice of America site. So that's what I was referring to. So, so lessons learned. And if people do the security sector reform on this scale in the future, it's something to keep in mind. You've really got to think about this from a holistic standpoint. It's not simply replicating something in another place. One of the big challenges before, Paul, I haven't forgot your question. I'm going to get to it and then the slide here shortly. But one of the big questions when I got there is there was a lot of consternation that contractors were involved. Oh, the contractors, the dirty contractors, the terrible contractors. And I won't go into naming some of the people who were constantly complaining about that. And while I'm not in favor or against contractors while I was on active duty, now I'm retired and a consultant, so maybe I have a different view. But seriously, at the time, my statement was this, and you probably caught it there in the short video clip from the Voice of America. It's not about whether they're contractors or not. It's about whether the people doing the job are competent and capable of achieving the goals and objectives. And that was the key thing here. So, a lot of people seem to think that we were just hiring people off the streets. No, DynCorp and PAE were hiring former military or retired military. Well, for Jeff's program out at Camp Ware at the Voice of America site for the basic training, and the first cohort that we ran out there was a group of 525 who arrived, and I think we graduated 485 because people didn't complete the training and fell out and left the military. But that cohort came out there, and I lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that. Senior moment. I knew it was going to happen at some point here.
Well, no, I think what you were going to try to allude to was our cadre of staff. So you got to remember we were running a. Still there?
I'm here.
Okay. We were running a basic training program, initial entry training program for the recruits coming in. So what do you need? We need drill instructors. So the people we selected had to have drill instructor experience, senior NCOs, at least anywhere between 10 years of service or more that were qualified, no kidding, drill instructors. The one thing I think we did shift was not only did we have drill instructors there, that were primarily Army drill instructors initially, and then we added some Marine Corps drill instructors, but the cadre that taught basic marksmanship for the most part were Marines. And as an Army guy, I hate saying this, but Marines tend to have better marksmanship training than the Army did. So we purposely hired Marines that were either part of sniper groups that came in that could teach the basic skills for these recruits to be able to handle and fire their weapons effectively.
Well, but you know why that is, Jeff? I mean, of course, Marines are dumped on a beach. There's nowhere to go back, so they have to be good shooters.
Yep.
The Army, we can maneuver around if we can't shoot well. Let me
That's
go
right.
ahead and try to address Paulie Sevenfire's question here. I'll address it, and then Jeff, I'll let you jump in. But let me do it because I'm doing it from inside the wire, from inside the government, and I was the contracting officer's representative. So on a day-to-day basis, all the activities for the contracts that were taking place in Liberia, I was the oversight officer. I was executive agent for executing those. Now, I had a lot of leeway, a lot of authority, but I never made major decisions, and certainly made no decisions that cost money without contracting or contacting the contracting officer back in the State Department. But our contracting officer was not in Liberia. She was back, Susan McCarty was back in the State Department in D.C. and would come out periodically. So day to day, the responsibility fell to me. This was between this and the rest of my job at the embassy, which wasn't just security sector reform. I worked 7 days a week, every day of the year for 12 to 16 hours a day. Now, don't cry for me, Argentina. I'm not complaining. I enjoyed it. It was a fantastic experience. But this is something that sucked all the marrow out of you. You had to be devoted to it. And the same thing applied for Jeff in his role. But let me go to Paulie's question. So from inside the wire, and then I'll let Jeff get in. So Paulie says, how was the contract awarded? The tender. Also, can Jeff perhaps give dollar signs, money reasons why DynCorp was preferred contractor, i.e. staff, capability, resources, and operational readiness? Okay. From my perspective, I wasn't there when the contracts were awarded. The statement of work was drafted up for both contracts prior to my arrival. But I will share with you a little consternation I have with this, in that I would say that from my experience, and I like to think it's objective, but people may disagree with that, but let me say from this standpoint, I would say that the contracts, the way they were divided up, I found to be quite odd. Why the State Department divided the labor between DynCorp and PAE, and they had both doing the same activities at the same time, and then a shift in which one did one thing and one did another. I never really understood that. Also, I would say that when it comes to PAE, its strengths as a company historically have been in construction and building things, and they're quite good at that. And DynCorp's strength had been training and developing people. And from my perspective at the embassy when I arrived, I had a mismatch. I had DynCorp still building things, and I didn't think that was their strength. Sorry, Jeff, I didn't think it was the strength of DynCorp at the time. And PAE building things and doing a good job of it, but PAE also responsible for mentoring and developing the soldiers once they arrived at their permanent party location after completing all the initial training. And I would say at that stage, I wasn't comfortable with PAE's ability to train as well as I was with DynCorp. So I'm not sure why the State Department divided up these contracts the way they did. I don't think it was a question of money. The total cost of the program was somewhere, I think we'd have to audit this and find out the actual dollar spent, but it was somewhere in the order of $253 million for this program. And now we're just talking about State Department money. We're not talking about money that Department of Defense spent. That's also an important point before I get to Jeff. This was a State Department program. The majority of the funding came out of the State Department account for peacekeeping operations, or PKO. The U.S. government gives them anywhere between $300 and $500 million every year to spend on peacekeeping operations around the world. This is apart and separate from the money we give to the United Nations or to the African Union. This is a separate fund that is spent on those missions, but is spent bilaterally, usually by U.S. government. And so we relied on that for peacekeeping because there was some latitude on how you could spend it, and this was post-conflict. So that's where most of the money came from, and there was a shortage of money, but I don't think that's what framed the basis of the contract. So that's my perspective from inside the wire after the contracts were set up. I will say this, and this is a little inside baseball, state secret, so to speak. The statements of work, from my perspective, were worded in a way that, as the executive agent for the contracts, I could exert influence, I'll let Jeff comment on that, on the vendors, the contractors, to remind them that it's important to accomplish the mission. And from my perspective, I didn't have to do that with one vendor. I'd maybe do it with the other vendor more. But I felt that the contracts were written loose enough for me to get the things that the U.S. government wanted to achieve in its foreign policy and what was needed for the Liberian people. An apolitical, professional military force that is small enough that it will not be a financial burden, but is large enough that it can be a force for good in Liberia. Jeff, want to comment there on the contracts?
Right. So the reason I think we were awarded this contract is because, as you mentioned, Chris, we do have training in our corporate DNA. We were known for our CivPo programs, civilian police programs, where DynCorp would go out and train police forces internationally. And so we were also involved in some training programs down in southern Sudan. So when this contract vehicle came out, we knew what was required. We wrote to the statement of work. We had a good bench of military retirees, military professionals who again had training in their DNA. So we wrote to that. We submitted the resumes of the key personnel, and we knew. And I think again, the big thing was our recruiting and vetting program. The State Department really liked the premise of what we were going to do. And by the way, this is something that I don't think Chris has mentioned. This has never been tried anywhere before, where you take an existing military, stand them down, retire them, and build a new military from scratch. So, the way we wrote our proposal highlighted all of those unique challenges and how we were going to accomplish it, and provide the government of Liberia and the country of Liberia a professional military force.
Yeah, it was quite unique, Jeff. But hopefully we answered Paula's questions there. He's got another comment here, and I'll come back to this if we remember. But it says, Jeepers, sounds like little continuity from what you've said so far. I'll comment on that a little bit later when I show the chart that I not so humbly call the PowerPoint slide that saved SSR in Liberia. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So, but just to give you an idea how quickly this went, once I got there and the U.S. government started providing, I wouldn't say adequate funding, but sufficient funding that we could continue the program. We did a lot of adjustments on the fly, especially Jeff and I, working out what DynCorp could accomplish for us and facilitate the flow of increasing the force. Remember, as he said, this is starting from scratch and rebuilding from nothing. So if you look there on that chart, you'll see in June 2000, everyone can see the chart hopefully, it's been up there for a while, but June 2007, we had 102 soldiers in the AFL who were trained, who had gone through recruiting and vetting, their basic training to become soldiers, their individual infantry training to become a specialist as an infantryman, and then 34 become non-commissioned officers and 9 had complete officer candidate school. So that was the state of the force when I arrived. The next class, the first cohort, which was 525 recruits out at Camp Ware in Carysburg, was kind of a proof of concept that we could do it out there, and Jeff ran that program. Now, that, as I mentioned, is an hour out there, an hour back. So for me, I went out there on the 60 days of basic training that they went through. I went out there 36 days, and usually I was out there very early in the morning. Now, Jeff was out there every day, so I'm not trying to compare, but what I'm just trying to say is that I had another job, and this was part of it. So this was quite a huge commitment, but it was that important that I was out there basically every other day at most of the time at a minimum, just to ensure that we were achieving what we wanted to achieve. And that was no reflection on a shortcoming or disbelief in DynCorp, but rather the fact that I just took over a program that is one of the most important foreign policy objectives for the United States at this stage in history, besides Iraq and Afghanistan. And I felt it was my duty to ensure that the government was getting what it was looking for and we were achieving what the Liberian people needed. So I spent a lot of time doing that. So September, we got that group graduated. They joined the 102. So by the end of September, we had 639 soldiers. By January, we had raised that to 1,124. April, 1,634. And then by August of 2008, I left the end of August, just before we activated the 1st Battalion. We had 2,137 soldiers in the AFL. We had activated 13 different companies, headquarters companies, the military police company, the engineer company, Alpha Bravo Charlie of the 1st Battalion, and so on. So we had activated 13 different companies, and we activated the 1st Battalion just after I left. So that's kind of the timeline on what we got done. Now, one thing we should mention here when it comes to training is that the AFL, in some respects, is very fortunate with the first cohort. Because the program was new and DynCorp was trying to do the right thing, they included a portion of basic training which went beyond what a normal soldier would get, say, in the U.S. Army. They included civics and respect for civil authority and the law of land warfare and things like that, which added to the length of the first course. After the first course, because funding had been so problematic and halting start and stop from the U.S. government, the decision was made that we will simply do the basic training and we'll try to find mechanisms for providing that training for soldiers later on. I will say that while it was a good intent, it proved to be almost impossible for me to do that. The limit of what I could do after that was occasionally get the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, to come in and provide training on law of land warfare and things like that. But we never recouped or recovered that portion of training which was essential and which honestly, in my view, and I'll get Jeff in here in a second, in my view, is one of the critical components of why the senior leadership of the AFL today is so professional. Not only is it because of their great individuals and their professionals, but also because they were steeped in this civics and civil authority and things like that. What do you think, Jeff?
Again, that's accurate. And there was a couple things too as well. One thing, and again, I mentioned earlier, we did after action reviews after each major event. One of the things that we learned based off that first course was that the trainees were able to pick up the training at a lot quicker pace than what we had anticipated. So, for example, even though the initial basic training course ran, I want to say 12 weeks, we were able to condense that back down to an 8-week course. But in order to do that, as Chris mentioned, we had to sacrifice some of the other training, like the civics. But yeah, so that condensed the course down a little bit. And then we found later on, through the years, other ways to make the civics class be part of the training curriculum.
Yeah, so they're kind of have it here. So one of the things, too, we should mention, I made this slide for a presentation I gave last year at Concordia University for the Liberian Society. I think that's what they're called. But I was asked to be a speaker to talk about the AFL and where they're at today. And I can't really profess to be a subject matter expert on where the AFL is today, but I do follow it, and I did, I think, an incredible job talking about them. And that'll be our slide on A Force for Good. But this slide here, the intent was to talk about, the challenge with this is that I've never had so many bosses in my life. I'm telling you, everybody was my boss. Actually, they were my boss, and a lot of people who weren't my boss thought they were my boss, and so that made for a very busy time frame. My cell phone basically melted every day, text messages and phone calls. I received, when I was at the embassy, on the order, remember this is 2008, social media is not nearly as active and email as it is today, but I received an average 1,500 email messages every day. And no, those aren't, Nigerian prince trying to get me to buy something. Those were legitimate business-related things. So typically for me, my Friday night would be trying to catch up with the messages that I wasn't able to get to, and I'd stay in the office till midnight or 1 or something like that on Friday nights, just going through my email because it was quiet then. But my point is back to bosses and expectations. What the AFL is or what it was supposed to be depended on where you sat. And so that's what this chart really talks about. So whose expectations? Well, if the AFL is a success or what it is or what it isn't, you have the governor of Liberia. And at the time we had President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and she did not want a force to be a problem because she had experienced oppression at the hands of the old AFL, having been imprisoned by them, among other things. But she did not want them to be a burden on society either. She's also an economist. She didn't want the government to be saddled with something they couldn't afford. So it had to be something that was affordable and was a force for good. You had Minister Samakai. He wanted to wanted relief for UNMIL. When I first got there, Minister Samakai turned to me and said, Major Wyatt, I need a battalion by this date. And I said, Minister, for what? He said, because UNMIL's leaving. And I said, well, okay, let's be honest here. In the history of peacekeeping in the United Nations, throughout its entire history, not a single mission has ever been authorized for more than 3 months. And this is true at that point. Now it's become habitual. But Liberia was the first mission ever extended beyond 3 months. It was extended for an entire year. And this was in 2007. And I said to him, that is a vote of confidence for the mission. It's not going away. And I said, besides, people are giving you rumors. They're not giving you facts. You need to talk to the force commander, General Okafor, because I've been to his briefing, and UNMIL is leaving in 6 years. They have a drawdown plan that starts this year, and they go from 15,000 to 9,000 within a couple years, and eventually they go away. But that's 6 years away. You don't need a battalion by this date. So, of course, his expectations and what he wanted a professional force that would be balanced. And the government also wanted that. They didn't want everyone to be from one ethnic group. They've seen problems with that before. They didn't want everyone to be from one location. Now, we will say this, is that the preponderance of people who joined the force were from Monrovia, but every ethnic group was represented almost by happenstance, rather on the road to serendipity. Every ethnic group was represented almost equally by their percentage of the population, because during the conflict, are you typing, Jeff?
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I can hear your keyboard. So every group, because during the conflict, all the people from around the countries, the 15 counties, fled into Monrovia to escape the war. So we had an unusual situation in which the population of Monrovia swelled and grew immensely from a small town capital to a big city. And in that big city, we had every group represented. So although most people joined from Monrovia, they were from different parts of the country. So that was unusual in itself. So you have those expectations. Then you have civil society. One of my biggest frustrations in Liberia was the following. If I had a nickel for every time I heard, well, no one's talking to civil society, we have no say in this program, we have no voice. If I had a nickel for every time I heard that, I would indeed be a wealthy man, a very wealthy man. But the reality is this, is that every time that we sought to engage civil society, it was hit or miss. It depended on what actor we were trying to engage. So, for instance, I engaged the Swanee Women's Foundation, I think that's the name of it. Interesting organization that was for women and girls' rights. And I went there to try to recruit women into the AFL, and I took a bunch of the female soldiers with me, officers and NCOs, and let them speak for what their experience was like to try to get them. And they worked with us. But there were other groups in civil society who would just bellyache and moan and then never show up when you planned an event for them. And so civil society, whether it's the press, now the press seemed at that time to be focused on salacious or outlandish or sensational stories to get attention. The press was just reforming, and it was a big deal. So they were helpful at times, but not always helpful. So what we did is we made ourselves as transparent as possible, provided transportation for the press to every event, answered any question they ever posed to us, and gave them lots of time on the hope that they would cover things fairly. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. The troop feeding issue, which hopefully we won't get into, was one of the instances they didn't handle it very well. But you have expectations from civil society and the press, from civil organizations, and from the Liberian people themselves. When you talk to Liberians on the streets, what they expect the AFL to be mattered. And so their expectations. Then you had the international community. The United Nations was an actor there, 15,000 troops, and the UN Secretary General Special Representative was also based there. And the United Nations ECOWAS had expectations about what this was supposed to be and what it was not supposed to be. And then, of course, the Mono River region, which is an organization that includes Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, they had expectations. And so we went to various ways to address these expectations, mostly by being transparent. We also did some interesting things. So, for instance, we didn't have enough trucks, and we didn't have the money to focus on trucks because we had to train soldiers. But soldiers eventually need trucks to drive to get around. So what we did until money would be coming in future budgets is we asked ECOWAS to help us in the security sector reform by requesting that they provide trucks that were not in use, sitting in Freetown at the ECOWAS depot. Now, that's a program run by the U.S. State Department, and the contract at the time was PAE. Spent about $18 million a year keeping that site operational, and it's a storage site from equipment that was left behind from when ECOWAS went into Sierra Leone to do peacekeeping. So they left a lot of equipment behind, and it's maintained. So we borrowed the trucks, but not simply borrow them and having PAE drivers bring them down. PAE took the RSLAF, the Royal Sierra Leonean Armed Forces soldiers, and gave them operational briefings, and they did mission planning. And then they conducted a military convoy from Freetown to the border, down to the Mono River. On the opposite side, PAE took the AFL soldiers, who were trained to be truck drivers. They did the same thing. They took them up to the border. They met at the bridge, shook hands. The Sierra Leonean soldiers switched spots in the truck, became the passenger, and the Liberian became the driver and drove back to Monrovia to EBK barracks. We had the press out there when they arrived. They interviewed the soldiers from Sierra Leone. They interviewed the Liberians. And then the Sierra Leone soldiers stayed for, I think, 2 weeks. We kept them. We hosted them. And the whole purpose of this was to be transparent, but also to get training value for the truck drivers from both sides, but also to build relations between the RSLAF and the AFL. And this was something that PAE and I conceived to get the trucks. And then so ECOWAS became a participant in, they're already doing it, but this is another way they became a participant in security sector reform for national defense. The RSLAF got to work with the new AFL and went home and told their bosses that this is not a super army, they're just soldiers and they're just trying to do the best job they can. You got joint training or combined training between two militaries and familiarization. So we accomplished a lot, plus it was in the press, which was good from a strategic communication standpoint. So everything that I tried to do was looked at holistically, every angle we could possibly get here, and get the most value out of that. So we had the Africa Partnership Station. It's a mission. I don't know if we'll talk about that, but that was something we did similar things with, building schools, communities, digging wells, and fixing roads. So a lot of this really was about reassuring people. So then the United States, of course, what does the United States want from this? Well, what do we get? A lot of people think that Liberia is important to America. Now, I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings here, and I really don't, folks, but the deal is this. At the end of the day, if I take 10,000 Americans and put them in a room and I mention Liberia, I might get half a dozen that have heard of it. I might get 5 that can point to it on a map, and I might get 2 that actually know that former slaves and free blacks from America moved to Liberia in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s and established a state which essentially was the colonization of the area. They colonized that part of West Africa on the indigenous population by imposing an alien political system, the one they knew, the American system. They adopted the same sort of system. Hence, they have a president and Senate and a House and counties and things like that. So contrary to what people think, at the end of the day, Liberia does not rise to the level of great importance to the United States. Not to hurt anybody's feelings. But on the opposite side of that, the U.S. is very important to Liberia. So what happens is that the U.S. wanted the following. We wanted a professional force that wasn't going to be a problem. Many people forget that during the 1980s, the United States government spent on the order of $500 million building the AFL, building facilities out at what is now EBK and other locations, all only to see it all come tumbling down. During the Reagan years, we spent a great deal of money supporting Doe and his government. It turned out to be quite a bad situation. So we had our expectations too, but it wasn't like we were looking for bases, which is a myth. That's a fairy tale. Trust me, I was inside that. I know that very well. That was never the case. We were simply trying to ensure that Liberia was not a problem spot going forward and help the people of Liberia. So you had all these different actors and different expectations, and that's kind of the challenge. So Jeff, you had to experience this sort of thing with different expectations and different actors coming in from different angles, and of course you probably had local businesses that are trying to get subcontracts. And I mean, what was this like for you?
Oh, I mean, you're right. I mean, they had different expectations. They thought this was going to be, business as usual, where, if a vendor wanted to win a contract from us, that they would do it, the way they've been accustomed to, which is offering either our procurement team or even myself kickbacks in order to get the contract. And the one thing I'm really proud of my team was that I hired, in my estimation, people of high integrity, high standards, because we need to set the example to the people that we were training. So if we're telling the AFL trainees that, hey, integrity is number one, and we're running, we're being hypocritical and not following that ourselves, that draws out a very negative picture. So, any contract that, any vendor that wanted a contract with us, again, they had to go through, the tender process where, we evaluate it based on their capabilities, based on cost, and that's the way it was awarded. So, Chris alluded to earlier that there may have been some government officials, like local government officials, that try to influence who we gave business to. We just wouldn't. We had to put the blinders on and the earmuffs on, and run these, the process, make it as transparent as possible. If anyone wanted to question why we awarded a food contract to this company versus another, our contract manager would show them exactly why they were not awarded the contract. And if they did want to do business with us in the future, this is what you would have to do to look for, either lower your cost, give us better quality of food, or things of that nature. to go forward. So yeah, it was again a challenging point for my staff out there. I think Octavian was on here earlier. Octavian was a vendor. Well, he was a program manager for one of our vendors who actually helped build the housing facilities for our trainers up there, and he had a procurement background, and I hired him to be one of our assistant procurement officers, and he did a great job in doing his board. So again, it's recognizing talent, doing the right thing, and trying to be the example again, because everyone, and Chris mentioned this before, everybody was watching us. I mean, everybody. So any instance of impropriety that they may have thought, that was magnified 10 times, and we had to deal with it.
Yeah, you should mention it. And I should jump in here too, Jeff. You've been complimentary to your team several times, and I've been trying to manage the broadcast and the stream and everything, and I should jump in here too and mention that. But before I do thank people and talk about what great people we had, listen, nobody's perfect. Our execution as the American government and the contractors and those soldiers in the AFL and the Liberian Ministry of Defense, nothing's perfect. We all made mistakes of some sort. But at the end of the day, it's did we accomplish the mission? That's what really matters. But yes, we all had issues. I had to relieve an officer and had him sent back on the next flight for his conduct, and that was something the ambassador's decision made. The ambassador made that decision based on my recommendation, and I caught a lot of flack from Americans who were there who did not understand what was going on. But the bigger picture was not that officer's pride or ego. It was the security sector reform program, the American reputation, as Jeff kind of alluded to. And we did send a few contractors back who were not either performing or who had stepped out of line. But those incidents were few, thank goodness. It wasn't something we had to deal with often, but we did deal with it. And I will say this about DynCorp and PAE. I don't control who works for them when I was in charge of the program from the government's perspective. But when I expressed displeasure with the conduct of someone, either by the contracting officer, the ambassador, or myself, normally that person was dealt with, well, they were always dealt with quickly, but oftentimes we didn't see that person in short order after that. They were sent home. Is that fair, Jeff?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the slide I have up now, so what about this? So what did we get? Well, the Armed Forces of Liberia, I would argue, is a force for good. So an example of this is something we did when I was there. My predecessor started it, and I thought it was a brilliant program. I took it a little bit further in that I brought the press into it so the public would be aware of it. But one of the things they did is that the U.S. Air Force ran the training program for the combat medics. They trained the AFL's medics, and they did 19 soldiers, 18 medics, and 1 medical supply specialist. And so they had threefold mission when they arrived at EBK barracks. They would go out and do training daily with the infantry unit because people get injured, and you have to have medics, just like in combat, so you have to plan and train as if you're doing the real thing. They also ran the dispensary or clinic, so there was 1 squad in the field each day, 1 squad in the clinic, and then the third squad, what they did is they took them into town to JFK Hospital in town. And they worked free with the Liberian doctors and nurses at that facility. And honestly, they were among some of the best trained medical professionals there in their uniforms every day. And most Liberians didn't realize this. It was a free service to the public. I don't know how long it continued after my departure, but I will tell you that my predecessor started. It was a brilliant program, and we brought the press out there at least 3 times during my time there. It was wonderful. Another thing we did is, or that the AFL does, is they provide maritime domain awareness. Before the Coast Guard was stood up, much to my disappointment, I didn't get to set the Coast Guard up. I'm gonna get back to teams. This gives me a point to think about that. Yeah, in the embassy, I had a fantastic team. I had great NCOs. I had great officers that worked for me, both reserve, guard, and active duty. And my deputy, Esley Peters, brilliant submariner. Submariners are strange people, and he's an unusual guy, but he was a great number 2 and did a brilliant job for me. Ran a lot of programs so that I could focus on security sector reform, like he was responsible for coordinating with the Navy for the African Partnership Station. And then I had some fantastic NCOs, Sergeant First Class Slew, and others who were there working for us. And, of course, the Liberian nationals that we hired at the embassy. We had 150 applications when we had a job posted, and the HR department gave us 50 resumes to look at when they narrowed it down. We went through the 50 resumes, and I selected 18 people that we would interview. And my NCO, Staff Sergeant Tomas, who was there before Slew, Sergeant Tomas, myself, and Commander Peters, Lieutenant Commander Peters, we interviewed as a panel each of those 18 applicants. From that, we brought 3 back, And in the end, we hired Zui Koli, who was a rock star. By the way, we poached her from Dying Corps, so from the vetting team. So she was a former Liberia National Police officer who was so well received that she became an instructor right after graduating from her basic course with the police. And then she was poached by Dying Corps to work in the recruiting and vetting, and then we poached her at the embassy. She's fantastic. I think she's since immigrated to the U.S. recently, but Zuli was fantastic. And then we also hired a medical doctor to run the HIV program. But the people that work for me and with me at the embassy, and then the people around me, the attaché, the ambassador, Don Booth, was just brilliant. The right guy at the right time with the right temperament. The deputy, the deputy chief of mission, Brooks Robinson. No, not the baseball player, but actually a lady named Brooks Robinson. She was wonderful. Our public affairs, strategic communications, Meg Riggs. She was wonderful. It was just a really great experience. A lot of support from within the embassy, a lot of recognition that what we're doing is important, and so it was a good experience. So I can't say enough good things about people. But yes, even there, nobody in my office directly, but somebody that was working for us had to be relieved. So that happened occasionally. So anyway, let me get back to the Force for Good thing here. So Maritime Domain Awareness, the Coast Guard was created, and they do interdiction. Before the Coast Guard existed, Chinese trawlers were illegally fishing and taking Liberia's maritime resources, and Liberians got nothing out of it. No licensing fees, no taxes, no nothing. And so there was also drug trafficking going on. I remember very fondly one day I saw the attaché and his naval attaché, the Marine, come back, Rob Plumble, and they were covered in dust. I'm like, where have you guys been? They had been out on a French ship, and the French were interdicting drug traffickers off the coast of Liberia. And the drug traffickers opened up bags of cocaine and were trying to shake it out in the wind behind their ship so they couldn't be caught with it. So all the crew on the French ship were covered in cocaine dust. So they had to get statements to say that they weren't doing cocaine, because they would definitely come up positive on your analysis after that. So that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. But the Coast Guard now provides an ability for maritime domain awareness, so that the people of Liberia, the government, has an idea what's happening on their shores and has some degree of control over it. We also put in a system that helped the AFL and the government, which does the tracking of commercial vessels that are offshore of a certain tonnage. That's another program. The Armed Forces Library do civic work, schools, roads, clinics. When I was there, one of the things we did is that we didn't have the money to buy equipment for the engineers. So we trained them in the concepts of combat engineering and of construction. And then as soon as the course was over, we scheduled it so that those engineers from the first class would go work with the Seabees, that's the construction battalions from the Navy, who were there as part of the Africa Partnership Station in early 2008. They spent 3 months in Liberia, 3.5 months. And so they did construction projects. So we sent the newly trained engineers to work with them. And they worked on like the Monrovia Demonstration School. They worked out in the Freeport, rebuilding schools and clinics and wells and things like that. Skills that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. And so I remember we opened up one of the schools out there, and the press was out, and they interviewed me, and thank you, appreciate you interviewing us. And they said, so the Americans, and I said, what do you mean Americans? They said, yeah, this is an American project. I said, yeah, but those are Liberian soldiers. Look at their sleeve. And of course, the Liberian soldiers have the Liberian flag with a single star on it on their fatigues. And it was only then that the journalists realized that most of the soldiers repairing the school were AFL soldiers. And they covered that story, and that's why I told them that. We wanted them to know that the Liberian soldiers, not only they're getting useful on-the-job training, they're using the equipment that the Seabees had available, which we couldn't purchase at the time, and they were working with a coalition partner. And most importantly, they were setting a good example for what a military can do to help a civil society. So it was really some cool stuff. When the Ebola viral outbreak took place in 2014, actually started in December 2013 when Médecins Sans Frontières first made people aware of it. Then the World Health Organization, I almost don't want to mention them today, but the World Health Organization started sending out messages in early 2014, but it wasn't until August of 2014 in which the world started to react to this, and that includes the government in Liberia. The Armed Forces Liberia played a significant role in helping the government in controlling things and getting resources where they need to be. So they played a very important role there. They've also been involved in peacekeeping. This is a country that just came out of 13 years of civil conflict, yet they've already contributed to peacekeeping. Since 2015, they've had troops in Mali. Unfortunately, they've lost a few soldiers. There's a photograph of Corporal Sharif's ceremony when he was returned in 2017. And then also, I don't know if it's happened, but they were scheduled to go to South Sudan, to send a platoon to South Sudan. So they're doing peacekeeping. And then the AFL is symbolic as a force for good. You know, when soldiers misbehave, if they're disciplined, which to my understanding is it happened when we were there, but I understand it still continues, they're disciplined, people are aware of it, and it's transparent, then people understand that this is a professional force that's there to protect people, property, liberties, and freedoms, and national sovereignty. It is not a force for predation upon the population. And so they're apolitical, they're professional, dedicated, service first, not a threat or danger, but a protector. And that's what we're hoping to achieve. And I would argue that the armed forces of Liberia today, despite extreme physical constraints, is exactly that sort of thing. Jeff, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing the type of stuff they were able to achieve towards the end, the various missions that they've done since we've left, you know, but again, that goes back to the type of training and that both companies did, and leading up to their capabilities of doing something good for the country. You were mentioning, you know, the engineering. I think they ended up building a couple of schools, if I heard right. And a lot of this is stuff that occurred after I had left. So I think they should be proud of everything they've accomplished so far and the missions they've gone and supported.
Jeff, I would agree with you. I'm highly impressed. So here's something interesting. I'll save it for the end, but I'll mention it briefly now. Is that for me, it's especially rewarding because I went there in 2007, and I honestly took the job because it was 12 months, it was unaccompanied, and I didn't have a great interest in being a security cooperation or security assistance officer. As an intelligence professional, attaché seemed to be something I wanted to do more. But once I got there, I realized what an amazing thing this is. And most of my time in Africa after that was spent in security cooperation, not attaché work. And I found it to be much more rewarding and I think impactful than being an attaché. Not to diminish the role of an attaché, it's a critically important role. But for me, security cooperation was really where it's at. So what was really rewarding for me is I went there as a major, promoted lieutenant colonel, and then at the end of my career, I was assigned to the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this year, now I was there when the academic year started, and I was there when it came for the transition course, but this year for the first time ever, I think in their history, but certainly with the new AFL, the Liberian government has sent a student to the U.S. Army War College. And that student, I think, is still on here. Murphy, are you still here? But he was in the first cohort of 525, Jeff, that we ran through. He's a private back there in 2007. Today he's a lieutenant colonel, and he is the first AFL student at the Army War College. And so
wow.
he'll be graduating here shortly. So for me, it became kind of full circle, really cool stuff.
And you know, I'm sorry.
What's that? You there?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to over.
No, go ahead.
But that's one of the things. Me as a PM, and you know, I consider every single graduate of the AFL one of my kids in a way. But you know, one of the things I really enjoyed was getting the when the embassy would send some of the AFL soldiers off to schools in the States, we would get the academic evaluation reports back from how they did. And one of the things that almost always every Liberian soldier that we sent back to the States, be it, you know, to be a drill sergeant, to CAS-Q, CGSC, or any of the other officer and NCO development courses, was the quality of the Liberian soldier, that they were probably among the best foreign students in those classes. So I always took pride in hearing it and seeing it. And even on Facebook, I still follow, you know, some of the soldiers that are gone, and just seeing how they progressed in their career since they were either privates or second lieutenants to becoming, like you mentioned earlier, Chris, you know, the MOD now, the you know, the Major General of the AFL. You know, it validates what we've done, and I take great pride in being a little part of that program for them.
No, I'm with you, Jeff, but here's something we've got to say right now, too, and it comes an hour and 29 minutes into this stream, but it is important. At the end of the day, all the efforts that we did were just the foundation, the structure, the superstructure to help Liberia get itself back on its feet. At the end of the day, it's the soldiers, it's the recruits, it's the people who join the AFL who are making the difference, who made the difference, and those who took it seriously as a affectation, not simply a job. You know, a lot of people forget that, especially the first two cohorts, that 102 and then the 525 that came after that, those people, incredibly patriotic, many of whom gave up what in Liberia were well-paying jobs to take a job that paid less than $100 US per month, not knowing if the military would continue, if it would survive, what it was like, but they joined because they were patriotic and they cared about their country. They had seen it torn apart as children, and they didn't want to see that ever happen again. So I know Liberians were making at the time $500-600 a month US driving for the UN, enlisted in the AFL to make $82 a month after taxes. $90, but $8 in taxes. They made $82 a month. Oftentimes, these people had families or significant others and children elsewhere who weren't living with them. So they had to maintain a household while serving. The sacrifices of the AFL soldiers should not be overlooked. The patriotism should never be downplayed. Jeff?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, you just agree wholeheartedly. I thought we'd get you to add in there. No, it's oftentimes something overlooked. So I've got a "Where Are They Now" slide up, and this is just a picture here. So you see that little shot of the Coast Guard up there interdicting a ship, something they're trying to do. Now, their Coast Guard's really just a brown water fleet, but that's fine. That's what Liberia needed. Maybe one day it'll be more than that, but brown water fleet. And in the upper right-hand corner, you see a photograph of Minister of Defense Daniel Ziakon, who, when I met him, was Second Lieutenant Daniel Ziakon. And now he is the Minister of Defense after having become the Chief of Staff of the military as a 2-star general. Below him, you see Major General Prince Johnson. Not that Prince Johnson from the conflict, a different Prince Johnson. This is Major General Prince Johnson, who was also Second Lieutenant Prince Johnson when I arrived there in 2007. Today, he is the Chief of Staff of the forces. In the bottom center, we have Brigadier General Geraldine George, also Second Lieutenant George when I arrived. And then if you see the bottom photo there, that's from April of last year, shortly after you arrived. That's Lieutenant Colonel Roland Murphy, who is on the stream with us today. And we took a snap in my office. And for me, it was very fulfilling to see that. It was wonderful to see someone from the AFL come to attend the Army War College, of which I, too, am a graduate and, of course, was a professor there for 4+ years. So it was really full circle to see this happen. Really good stuff. I really enjoyed it. Now, there's a couple questions here. We'll get these before we leave here today. Let me go back. I saw, this is from Paulie. Jeff, Chris and Jeff, did you ever have those clowns from the African Union try to disrupt politically what you guys did and were doing that period? No, I never experienced that. The African Union, I almost didn't know they existed during my time in Liberia. ECOWAS, a different story. ECOWAS played a big role, in part because there was a lot of Nigerians in UNMIL, and there were a lot of Nigerians who had ties and relationships to the government of Liberia. So there were Nigerians around. And so whenever there's Nigerians, there's usually some sort of ECOWAS presence. And ECOWAS was involved, and they were a player, and they helped us. I dealt with ECOWAS and the United Nations far more, and well, I never dealt with the AU. I didn't even know they existed. I mean, of course, I knew they existed, but for all intents and purposes, the AU was not involved in anything we did. Did you ever hear from the AU or anything like that, Jeff? I don't think so.
No, not in Liberia. On a different contract vehicle, we dealt with them in Mogadishu, but nothing in Liberia.
So from Jeremy, good question, Jeremy, since you were part of this. In retrospect, and in light of some critical reviews, for example, RAND and New York Times, was the cost of SSR program worth the juice with respect to U.S. foreign policy and African security development? I would say unequivocally, without a single doubt, without a shred of doubt in my mind, what the United States and the government of Liberia attempted to accomplish with security sector reform for national defense in Liberia was a brilliant concept and undertaking, a challenging thing to execute, and has been a force for good and has been something very useful. And beyond that, the world, if it pays attention, can take a lot of valuable lessons learned about how you do this and the way it can be done successfully, and also look at the shortcomings and failures that we had, because we had those as well. But no doubt it was worth the juice. $253 million. We pissed $500 million down the drain building barracks and training soldiers who simply went out and some of them misbehaved and really did nothing to stop a 13-year civil war. So that was in the 80s. So $253 million in 21st century inflation-adjusted, quantitative easing, ruin our currency value dollars is quite a bargain, I would argue. And I don't know that we actually spent the $253 million. We might have. But I would argue that the money was spent was very good. Now, if you're going to ask me about Onward Liberty, which was a mentoring program that followed, the value of that, I'm a little more critical of that. I was not there, but I observed it from afar, and that was an African Command program. But as far as security sector reform, yeah, it was definitely worth it. The problem I have with the program is that people didn't communicate effectively, in my view, what the program was, either within the U.S. government or from the U.S. government to West Africa, to the United Nations, and to others, and to the Liberian people. I don't think we did an effective job of that. And I think that led to some of the challenges that weren't necessary. But I would argue that without a shred of doubt, this was money that was worth the juice. I hope I answered your question, Jeremy. Jeff, your thoughts on that? Was it worth the money and time?
Yeah, I think so. As a matter of fact, I think they got a bargain out of it because, remember, we due to a lot of the efficiencies that we came up with, we were able to do more. We were able to add additional value to the contract than what was originally expected of us. Standing up the Armed Forces Training Command, that was not part of the original contract. And, the whole purpose of the Armed Forces Training Command was that once the contractors left, who's going to continue training the troops? Who would continue to, train the next generation of AFL soldiers? So, and again, that was part of that original $253 million price tag that was not a part of the plan. So yes, and from my perspective, I think that was money well worth spent.
Well, Jeff, it's funny you should mention that with the Brigade Training Unit, as it was originally called, BTU, which sounds like British Thermal Unit, so I never liked the name. It's funny you should mention that and how it was done. But as I recall, I approached you in mid-2007, and we kind of broached the topic initially, and we talked about it, and then I think you went back and kind of worked some plans up on how we could do this. If I got the timeline wrong, let me know. But by the fall of 2007, U.S. fall, so September, October, you and I were sitting down talking seriously about how do we get people who have been assigned a permanent party who are now developing leadership skills and have an acumen for training to be qualified to be training instructors. And I think it was in December I approached you and said, can you give me a training program? You designed a training program, a 6-week training program to teach AFL officers and NCOs how to be platform instructors to teach in the classroom and also teach in the field. And that's when we really got it started. And before I left, you ran that program several times, and I think we had like 187 graduates who were technically qualified to be instructors in the AFL. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And the cream of the cream of those 180 plus students, we identified, and again, I've got some of mine, Jeremy, who I think is on the chat right now, who's one of my instructors. I mean, they identified potential candidates that should be allowed or given the opportunity to go back to the States to become drill instructors. And the one thing, I know it's not probably part of this conversation, but I would tell you the very last training class that graduated from Liberia was a 100% trained by Liberian instructors. I mean, we were there to kind of hold their hands. We were there to be in the background. But the graduates of this training program graduated the last class of 100 Liberian trainees. And it was due to, again, to Chris's vision of having Liberian AFL instructors to carry the flag forward. So, and again, that was another, watershed moment for us because we had all of our core instructors for the first time sit in the stands and watch that final graduation led entirely by Liberian officers and instructors.
Well, Jeff, thanks. That's very kind words of you. But I know you know this, and it won't come to surprise you. But I ran into buzzsaws, resistance, and downright consternation from a number of folks who didn't like the idea that I was looking long-term strategically and trying to make sure that this was supposed to be something sustainable beyond our departure. I didn't create the concept of being sustainable. That was the whole idea. That's why it's only 2,000 soldiers. We don't want to commit the Liberian government to paying salaries for 10,000 soldiers they don't need. So that was the vision I was given, make it sustainable. And I don't think many people thought about, well, gee, what happens when we leave? Well, when we leave, someone's got to take responsibility for these vehicles. They've got to take responsibility for the generators, for the security. And you don't just one day get up and leave and then the AFL takes over. You have to transition. And so when it came to training, seeing the bang-up job that your drill sergeants, foreign drill sergeants were doing and accomplishing out at Camp Ware, it became apparent to me that we need to train a cadre. And so you were very flexible, DynCorp was very flexible, but I did run into a buzzsaw with some other folks who didn't believe in the concept. I was told, well, they're not ready. I'm like, well, when will they be ready? In every cohort, there is an Alexander the Great. There is someone that rises above innately because of the nature of who that person is. They just have the leadership skills and the ability to communicate. In every cohort. It might be one person, maybe it's 3 people in a group of 10,000, but there's always someone. And there's always a few people just below that level of expertise or natural ability that have enough ability that they can be trained to do things by taking what they have naturally. And so at a minimum, we should be able to find a few folks like that. And I argue for that, but I had to put the hammer down on a few folks, not your people, but a few folks around a few different locations to convince them of this. And at the end of the day, I probably would have been stopped, save for the fact that contract renewal was coming up, and people wanted to get their contracts renewed. And so I got some help there because one of my favorite phrases became, you realize that I don't have any say in the renewal of a contract, but the government technical monitor, as the government technical monitor, I am the eyes and ears of the contracting officer, and past performance is a key component of future contract award. So that became a big part of my speech for a while there. But it wasn't just there that I ran into some problems. I also ran into some problems with some other folks. And ultimately, honestly, Jeff, you might know this, but if you don't know this, at the end of the day, we got the training program, not just because you guys designed it, I reviewed it, we edited it, and we modified it, and you guys made it happen with your instructors. Adam Hyde, you didn't hire any new people. You did.